All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. If you haven't watched a webinar or any of our videos, I'm Dr. John Lohr with Science Olympiad. I work in our national office, and this is probably one of my favorite activities that I get to do as part of the program because I get to learn a whole bunch of new and cool things right alongside of you. And I have the distinct pleasure of, introducing you to, I think, some very cool people. So tonight we're going to hear from Jules Seabright, coming to us from Thursday on the other side of the planet in Queensland, Australia. But before I turn it over to Jules, I want to just hit on a couple of quick things. First, this is being recorded, and everyone will get a copy of the recording. Plus, we're going to put it up on our YouTube page. The other thing is, should you have any like technical questions. So, hey, like, did the screen freeze or I'm hearing a weird echo or something like that? Please put those kind of comments in the chat. The other thing to put in the chat is should Jules ask you any questions, put your answers or ask you for ideas or any of that kind of stuff, put those responses in the chat. If you have any questions for Jules, please put those in, use the Q&A feature. And you can find the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. It's usually kind of in the middle of the page. It's the box with the question mark inside of it. It says Q&A under it. But without further ado, then I'm going to turn it over to our Science Olympiad alum, a great friend of the program, and author. And I think someone that's doing some really cool work, again, on the other side of the planet. So, Jules, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. John, for the wonderful introduction. Can we hear me all right? If you have any issues with hearing me or seeing me, yeah, just drop it into the chat. We'll get it sorted out. I mentioned earlier to John when we were setting this up that I'm in far north Queensland and we have a little bit of patchy weather going on with the cyclones this time of year. So I'm actually set up in a different office because my internet went out at home. You prepare for everything, but you can't be prepared for each little last thing. Now, before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I work and live here in far north Queensland, here at this specific site, that's Hagimwe Walabari Yidinji people. But there are many other rainforest Aboriginal groups known and extant and very active across the wet tropics and across the rest of Australia, which, as you may or may not know, has a really long and pronounced colonial history. And I'd like to acknowledge that respect, to extend that acknowledgement and respect to all First Nations people here attending this today. While acknowledgements of country are pretty much a matter of course in Australia, if you're coming to this lecture from other parts of the world, you may be less familiar with them. Now, hopefully I can get the controls working. So what's this lecture all about? It's been a while since I was working in the lecture-based Science Olympiad space. It's more that I take those learnings and share them with the public in my own work these days. But we're going to talk about just one individual path, my individual path of taking a passion for nature and animals and insects and entomology and making that into a career that has real impact in the world today. Quick fun fact, at the time I took this picture, I thought that was a Werdeman stick insect, but now looking back on it, we're pretty sure, but not 100% sure, since I don't have the specimen, that that was an at the time undescribed species now known as Acrophila alta, because that picture's a couple years old, which just goes to show you how quick science continues to discover new things in this part of the world. But for those of you who don't know me, I think we only have a couple participants I can see, but for anyone that doesn't know me, I am a former Science Olympiad alum. We'll talk about my history in a little bit here from more than a decade ago. It's been a long time. And since that time, I've gone through a variety of different careers, but always leading my way back to ecology, science, and nature. What I do nowadays here in Australia is work in biosecurity, which, if anyone's not familiar with the field, is essentially the protection of biological resources, agriculture and environment, lifestyle features that are enriched or supported by ecology and biodiversity from invasive threats, and that can be anything, pests, weeds, diseases, all sorts of things. So my specific focus area is working in this wet tropics of Queensland region on ants, invasive ants, and protecting native ants. but biosecurity goes a lot further than just entomology. And we will talk about the ants book as well. But first, how did we come to this place? What was going on all those many years ago? So well before there was Science Olympiad in my life, I was just a really strange kid who was really into insects. And I want to take a moment to highlight this poem that we found a few months ago while cleaning out the house from literally decades ago. And it shows you that some things really never change. I see myself catching an unknown butterfly. It hasn't happened yet. I want to see every bug in the world. That isn't likely to happen because there's just so many undiscovered ones, but I love the ambition there. I'd cry if I was stung by a scorpion. Newsflash to little tiny babies, Jules, you do get stung by a scorpion. In fact, it happens a lot, and you don't cry. But my favorite stanza is the last one. I understand insects must be left in the wild. I say leave insects alone. I dream of being an entomologist, and I hope that there will be bugs forever. So that's a sentiment that, even though I didn't remember the poem, I've carried with me for a long time. What does that take us after these early years? Well, flash forward to around 2009, 2010. The reason I put multiple years in here is that this phenomenon happened multiple times. So I was, during that time, a member of the Centerville High School Science Olympiad team. A member of that team that was very fortunate to place first in the national competition in both 2009 and 2010. And I was increasingly even more fortunate than that to be one of the individual event winners in 2010. And by virtue of that experience, not only did I gain incredible team building experience through Science Olympiad and a breadth of experience across many different areas of science, areas that I found really interesting, but I was able to attend university at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So that's what we see going on here. A preoccupation, sorry about the dead bird, preoccupation with animals, nature, and wildlife continued, and I took lots of ecology courses. Despite starting out in engineering, I found myself drawn to the world of ecology. Over there on the right, that was actually pre-uni days, but I put it into highlight around the time I was starting to get tired of this whole snow business. That brings us to graduate school. After a period of working after my undergraduate degree in America, I decided to attend graduate school in Australia and pursue my master's degree in Cairns in far north Queensland. So you can see here what the result of that was like. I graduated in 2020, late 2020, from James Cook University in North Queensland, Australia. And my master's project was focused on ants. I want to highlight to you that I didn't really know anything about ants, despite being interested in insects before I came to Australia. It all developed really quickly after then. So even though I already had an interest in insects and nature, this specific interest didn't come to me until later in life, which goes to show you that you have time to discover your focus area yet. Well, of course, making time for more amazing stick insects. That's on campus, by the way. Never know what you find walking around at night in the tropics. And that pretty well brings us up to today. So that's me at one of our field sites. And you can see the little badge down there. I've not got a pointer, unfortunately. The little badge of the Yellow Crazy Ant Eradication Program. So my job today, and where I've worked for the past 5 years, is with the Wet Tropics Management Authority, an organization up here that's dedicated to protecting the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area, which is those beautiful mountains you can see in the background there. And our specific goal of my team, I lead the science team within the Yellow Crazy Ant Eradication Program. What we do is work on eradicating an invasive species of ant, the yellow crazy ant, just that one specific species that's found in this part of the world and was introduced back around 2001. So the yellow crazy ant is a small ant, about 4 millimeters. It's an invasive species, so that falls under that pest and weed biosecurity target that I spoke about earlier. While they don't have a really strong bite or sting, they spray acid. That's their weapon against their prey. And it can be debilitating to other small insects, small animals, and even larger animals. The yellow crazy ant's secret strategy is their supercoloniality. So unlike other ants, the nests don't compete. They all work together in basically one gigantic mega nest that can be hundreds of hectares or many square miles. And this species is invasive right around all the tropical regions in the world, although they're native to Southeast Asia. So you'd be familiar with them, I believe, in Hawaii, Samoa, There are many Pacific islands in Central America and other areas the species is known. And they're targeted for local eradication here, even though we can't get rid of them Australia-wide because of the value of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. I didn't really go into much of this earlier, but many of you might be thinking when you think of Australia, a really dry, flat, arid land with lots of red sand and rocks, things like that, kangaroos bouncing along. But the reality is that's only true for about 96, 97% of the land area of Australia. There is still a tiny 2 to 3% area that isn't desert, isn't coastal, and is in fact the world's oldest continually surviving and one of the most biodiverse rainforests on the planet. That's the wet tropics in far north Queensland. This area has survived because the high mountains that have existed since ancient times have helped to preserve rainforest fauna that was eliminated across the rest of the continent when it drifted into a more arid area of the world due to continental drift many millions of years ago. So that means that the rainforest is really wet and really, really mountainous and very biologically unique, which is why we need to protect it from yellow crazy ants, because invasive species here, if they establish, stand a chance of eliminating a lot of our really precious native species that aren't found anywhere else. You don't have to read this whole slide. This is not actually that important. So in my program, you can see we're a pretty sizable team. We currently employ actually more than that now, full-time and seasonal staff. I'm a full-timer, but I started as a seasonal. We work with everyone in the community to bring people on board to do yellow crazy ant eradication. And we're informed by scientific research to search and destroy all the yellow crazy ants in the region. How are we going? Which in Australian means how are we doing? As you can see, back in 2016, 2017, after we got that first flush of funding, we were able to detect a lot of ants. The red is the yellow crazy ants. As we've moved ahead to recent years, we've been able to clear a lot of those areas. What this map doesn't show you, however, is that there's new detections south of here. You can spy one of them there, which are continuing to be an ongoing challenge for our program. So it's kind of like the more you look, the more you find, but we've proven we can get rid of them. We are one of the rare cases on this planet of a biosecurity success story against ants, which, as you may or may not know, are some of the toughest animals to get rid of in the world. Ants are incredibly resilient. What does my part of that look like? Well, it's absolutely something different every day. To run you through these quickly, that's not actually me in the top left. What we're doing there is collecting soil samples to test them for ant DNA to see if we can improve our detection capability. What's going on in the bottom left with that huge hammer? I am crushing a log to pieces to try and dig out yellow crazy ant queens so we can captive culture them. In the middle, just on the power tools, cutting up some training aids for our ant detector dogs. And the ant detector dog, you can see her down in the bottom right as well with her handler, trotting over to do a test with these same training aids. Then on the top right, I want to stress that while there's a lot of fun field and power tools and elements like that in the job, there's also a huge amount of diagnostic work, sitting and looking through the microscope and telling me what each of those individual little tiny ants is. But there's more to it than just the work inside the office and in the field. As Dr. John mentioned, I am an author as well, and I was incredibly fortunate to be supported in my job to publish my book, The Amazing Ants of the Wet Tropics Field Guide, through the Wet Tropics Management Authority more than a year ago now, I believe, July 2025, 2024. Anyway, this is a really fun and approachable educational guide targeted at families and young kids, but really anybody of any age, to learn about ants and the amazing species that make the wet tropics so special, which we will talk about later. But I just added a couple of snaps here from the launch event, teaching kids about ants, the ants in those enclosures down there, and that big metal thing is an ant nest. So it goes to show you that kids are naturally fascinated by animals and insects. And people that live up here in this part of the world understand that insects are part of life we can't get rid of, we can't step away from. So it's better to learn to appreciate them than to feel like you're embattled all the time. There is a link to the book. You can download it for free, and I'll drop that after this lecture. But speaking of ants, educating the public about ants and the ants of the wet tropics, I wanted to move along to a really quick blast through tour of some of my favorite genera of ants in this region of the world. So that's just a quick picture of me giving a lecture at the Cairns Botanic Gardens about ants and about this book. And the one in that picture, she is a queen green ant. So you can see the queen there with her little eggs for her first generation. So the first thing you need to know about Australian ants is they're not messing around. We have possibly the antiest country on the planet right here, and I'm so lucky to be living in Australia today. Australia has more species of ants than anywhere else on Earth, and we're pretty close to having the most genera too. For anyone that isn't familiar, genera is the plural form of genus, which is the classification just above the species level. So a genus contains many closely related species. Like this one here, which is in the genus Myrmecia, the bull ants, of which we have many species. So you might notice from the image there that the diversity of ants looks to be pretty high up in far North Queensland. That's in the northeast corner, and down in the southeast as well, because those are the areas that are most mountainous. They have those remaining patches of remnant forest or rainforest. Resistant to fire over millions of years, it's preserved all those species. However, note also that the ant fauna in the rainforest is kind of depauperate in certain taxonomic levels, and really a lot of the species diversity comes out over the arid zones because of certain geographic and geologic features that create little islands of stone between seas of grass where different species can develop. All that is to say, though, that we have a ton of different ants, and we have some of the coolest ants in the world. Not that I'm biased, but I'm definitely biased, so let's meet a couple of them. First of all, the iconic green ant. If she looks fierce, that's because she is. I've featured these because they are absolutely iconic to the far north. Everyone who lives here knows them. Everyone who lives here has been bitten by them badly, many times. They're super pugnacious, but I've put them in because they're really sophisticated in how they make their nests. As you can see from the larger picture here, they've got silk woven between leaves. And the secret to that is not that these ants spin silk like spiders. In fact, it's actually child labor. They pick up their own larvae, which can spin silk, and use the larva like a living glue gun to weave strands of silk between the leaves, pulling them together into a big leaf balloon, inside which the ants can happily construct the rest of their nest. So it's very sophisticated how they bridge gaps and do their engineering feats to bring these leaves together into little palaces. Next up, I've included this Leptomyrmex or spider ant because she's got a big replete gaster, that's the bum end on the back, the butt of the ant, and she is one of what we call the honeypot ants. You might have heard of honeypot ants before, and they're culturally significant in Australia, in many areas of Australia, to many different cultures. But the truth is there's many different kinds of honeypot ants. So not just the desert honeypots, Camponotus inflatus, which live out in the desert areas, but here in the wet tropics, we have honeypots of our own. That's these beautiful little spider ants. One of my absolute favorites. They're very gentle, curious ants with no bite or sting. And they always look like they're wearing cute little socks because of their white feet. Next up, I want to return again to the beautiful bull ants, Myrmecia. This is a Myrmecia piriformis. She's about middle size. And those aren't inches, so don't worry. They are centimeters. But that does go to show you that she is a very sizable ant. And Myrmecia are some of the most interesting ants in the world. They're super primitive, which is why they have those big eyes. So instead of using their sense of smell to antennate their way around like many other ant species, they track visually, and they signal each other visually too. So when they're alarmed or they need to raise the alarm in the nest, they enact semaphore maneuvers, waving their legs and antennae to let each other know that there's a crisis on and we need to defend the nest, whereas most other ant species use a pheromone. Another cool thing about Myrmecia is they have excellent distance vision. They can see you from meters away, which for us humans would be like seeing for miles with exceptional clarity. And I also happen to think they're some of the cutest ants around. One last fun fact about Myrmecia. They're one of the deadliest ants in the world. Their venom packs a powerful punch, and in Tasmania, the species Myrmecia pilosula, or the jumping jack ant, has an incredible phenomenon of about 3% of the populace being anaphylactic to it. It's such a serious issue that the government has in fact instated a treatment regimen where people who have tested for anaphylaxis can come in and get desensitized via repeat microdoses so that they don't die when they stumble on these ants, because they are everywhere. Myrmecia also contains some of the largest ants in the world. such as the one that lives up here, Myrmecia gulosa, and I've personally captured, brevinota, sorry, personally captured specimens of that species in excess of 3 centimeters, which is incredible for an ant. I'm bringing up another species here, Polyrhacus trapezoidea, to show you the beauty of Polyrhacus, or the spiny ants. I personally think they should have called them the shiny ants, because they have incredible colors and patterns. Silver, gold, red, purple, green, blue. Polyrhacus has them all. And these ants are known for being arboreal and highly speciose. So you find them all through the rainforest. There are many species yet unknown. Now on to something a little bit less obtrusive. These are the famous Dracula ants, which is on one of the last pages in my book. You'll notice if and when you download it. These ants are cool. As you notice, they don't have any eyes, or they have very reduced eyes, which is an indication that they live below the soil's surface, burrowing around. But the special feature for these ants is how they feed their queen and their adults. Now, adult ants can't eat solid food. They can only suck up liquids, but the larvae can eat solids just fine. So the solution these ants have come up with, instead of doing something normal like going and getting some nectar or some fallen fruit to sip on, they pierce their own larvae and drink their blood. Insect blood is called hemolymph. They drink their own hemolymph. And amazingly, this doesn't seem to harm the larvae. They survive and thrive right through it. But that's what gives them the name Dracula or vampire ants. And finally, my personal favorite. This is a trapjaw ant. And if you're lucky enough to live in the tropical or subtropical parts of America, you might be familiar with these amazing snapjaw ants. They're found right around the world in all the tropical zones. And I love them because of a lot of different reasons. I like how their jaws snap shut to capture prey at a moment's notice. I like how they prowl around through the undergrowth like little tigers. I like how they're big and charismatic. And I just think they're terribly interesting. They even communicate using sound. They can make a slight squeaking noise by squeezing their abdomen really fast if they're agitated, as well as the snapping. So they're just a really interesting ant. Now, I could spend all day talking about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, nearly 1,000 species of ants that live in the wet tropics, but we need to move on to a bit more general entomological concepts. So I'd like to talk a bit about how we, in my job, study ants and study insects, and why we do it. In this picture, you can see several of my team, the science team, taking field data about ants. The way that we measure ants, or ways that we measure ants, really depends on the question that's being asked. For us, when we get rid of yellow crazy ants, there's no simple way to do it. You can't go out and squish every one. You've got to blanket treat them with a powerful insecticide. And in doing that, as you might imagine, there are impacts as well on the native species of invertebrates. So when we're studying insects, we're mainly looking at the biodiversity of the area. Biodiversity meaning the summary of all the species that are present there before an intervention or as a baseline level. We want to know if that biodiversity has changed since we put down this insecticide treatment. We also want to know if yellow crazy ants affect the biodiversity. Why? Because if we prove that they do, we can get more funding out of it. Pretty simple, but important to remember when you're doing any kind of science project that requires public funding. So what you can see going on in these images is several of my staff collecting samples in the field, taking down data. Over on the right there, we've got Alex doing some picking, hand harvesting of invertebrates off a sample plot. And on the left, we have Kelly doing some sorting of samples. So it's not all fun field work. There's a fair lot of laboratory work as well, going through hundreds and hundreds of animals, sorting them out, identifying them. And I just want to highlight for you, over the past 8 or so years, we've captured something like 250,000 individual animals over our sampling rounds. And we only go out sampling 3 times a year in these sites anyway, which goes to show you just how many ants there are, even in the areas affected by yellow crazy ants. What happens after we collect those samples of insects? Usually when you collect them, you're not just picking tiny bugs. No one can see that well, even with glasses. You have to scoop up a big sample of leaf litter. Now, I had a video of this, but unfortunately the PowerPoint would accept the file size. So I've just got pictures. You scoop up a big sample of leaf litter off the forest floor, really quick so no insects escape. Dump it into one of these funnels and hang them with a little bottle of alcohol or ethanol underneath. Exposed to the heat and the sun, instincts instinctively travel downwards into what they think is the safety of the soil. But in this case, they just fall into the alcohol. That gives us a nice clean sample. No need to go digging through all the leaf litter, and we can easily sort through and identify all the insects that were in that leaf litter. Now, why do we choose leaf litter instead of going up and looking in the trees or digging fully down in the dirt? Well, we selected that because yellow crazy ants mainly live in the leaf litter. They live on the ground, not in the trees, not below the soil surface. So the ants that are going to be affected by the yellow crazy ants' presence are also present in that area. While it would be interesting to see the effects on canopy or other invertebrates, we chose to focus on ants living in the leaf litter because that would give us the clearest picture, the quickest possible answer. And this is the survey that I was telling you about, terrestrial invertebrate sampling. So we do leaf litter sampling, we also do the direct picking I showed you in that picture, and finally we dig in pitfall traps, which is just a cup set into the ground, its edge flush with the soil surface and filled with a preservative. When insects walk in, they can't get out, and we have our little sample. Super easy. The goal of these surveys is to assess whether the yellow crazy ants are affecting the biodiversity of native insects and whether the treatment we use to treat yellow crazy ants is affecting the biodiversity. We measure the species richness of the ants, which requires us to identify them all as species, and that's tough. And the higher taxa richness, so not just the number of genera or different groups of ants, but also, for example, how many mites, how many beetles, was there a slug in the sample, things like that. You'd be amazed at things that we pull out of these samples. And these surveys are still ongoing. But that's not all the science we do. There are literally dozens of other projects, and I've chosen to highlight one here just because I think it's interesting and colorful. When you treat yellow crazy ants with insecticide, you need to know how much insecticide to put down. You put too much, you start killing the other animals. Put too little, you don't succeed in getting rid of the yellow crazy ants. So how do we know how much to put and how dense to deploy it? Well, enter the food coloring. Why are those yellow crazy ants turning to red crazy ants and blue crazy ants? It's because we've put a little bit of sugar water in a water crystal and hydrated it and colored it with food coloring to dye these ants a bright color. And in doing so, we can follow them back to their nest. We've done this at a couple of different sites with different habitats. Hopefully you can see there's some clearing areas, there's some forest areas. And the reason we do this is to understand how far they forage from the nest. So that tells us, for example, if they're only foraging half a meter or so, we need to put the bait out pretty densely. But if they can forage many meters, we can put it out a bit more sparsely as long as we're within the permit requirements. And what we found was these ants normally forage between 1 to 2 meters. Now that's still quite a hike for an ant that's 4 millimeters long, but it's not something crazy like 50 meters, something you'd expect a bee to do, for example. Now I want to talk about the reality of doing field work. So if you've been watching this so far, you might be thinking, this all sounds pretty fun. You're living in the rainforest, seeing all these cool animals and ants and insects, and it looks really fun doing that field work. Well, it is, but I need to talk to you about if you want to get into field work full-time or even part-time, being prepared for the reality of working in a field scenario and specifically some quirky things about life in Australia. So this is an actual picture of my actual coworkers, just going to show you that even if you plan your day as best as possible, you get to the end of the day, you've collected your samples, you're planning for the next day's field site. A random horse could still suddenly appear, nudge your pocket, and suddenly your sample is gone. And this wasn't like a farm horse, it was just a bush horse. Horses are another one of our invasive species that is present in this part of the world. So in far north Queensland, we call it the wet tropics, an emphasis on the wet. Probably one of the most serious threats that we face day in, day out is the weather. And I've shared these quick snaps, they're not even all from the same storm, from a series of interesting tropical lows, weather events, and cyclones that have come across our path in the past couple of years. So what you can see there on the top left, the bottom left, and the middle image are all repercussions of Cyclone Jasper, which had its impact around just after Christmas time 2023, absolutely shredded the region, devastated major travel lanes, roads, many households were lost. And it was serious for biosecurity as well because ants spread in flood debris really well. So all that mapping that we've spent years making has a possibility of becoming less valid when there's been a huge flood in the area. However, all is not lost. We can map the floodwaters, and using that, we can determine what areas need to be targeted for future surveillance. But obviously, it's pretty hard to carry out field work when the road itself is crumbling away. Down there in the bottom left is our airport. That is actually how our airport looked during the extent of the flooding. And there on the right is actually from a more recent tropical low event in the far north. Yes, that is a 4-meter crocodile on the road. Why did the crocodile cross the road? I didn't stop to ask him, but it just goes to show you that every waterway needs to be treated as suspect in this part of the world. We call it being croc-wise. Another problem that we have to deal with every day is the terrain. I mentioned earlier, in this part of the world, we have exceptional biodiversity in our rainforests. That biodiversity is produced by the steep mountains that make sure this area gets consistent rainfall. That means the steep mountains are not negotiable. That are actual pictures of what the terrain is like in some of our working areas. Some of the more astute of you might be picking out, that looks like pretty dry forest. Didn't you say it's rainforest? Yes, it is wet sclerophyll, so on the edge of that rainforest area. Why don't I have any steep rainforest pictures? Because it was too steep to have a hand free. It had to be all fours getting through the bush in those sites. It was too dangerous. Even these dry forest sites, it's like walking on marbles. And don't forget the death adders that live under every other rock and log. A little bit more on terrain. The wet tropics is riddled with beautiful waterways, but there isn't really an easy way to get across them. And these massive granitic boulders that were produced when the area was uplifted from basaltic substrate millions of years ago mean that they can be really treacherous. So on the left, with his face blocked out, is one of my coworkers pulling a super illegal stunt, climbing across the waterway. What upset me most about that is he didn't ask my permission as his manager, and what's dangling on his belt, that white bucket there, was our sample. If he fell in, whatever, but if he lost the sample, I would have been really cross. But he made it across just fine. And me on the right there, you can't actually see the waterway under me, unfortunately, because it's zoomed in. But we were about to do a little bit more scrambling across another creek that was in flood after flooding rains. So it's always drought or flooding rains. That's what we've got here. And then finally, there is the wildlife. I would say the good, the bad, and the middle of the road, but I think they're all amazing. A couple of highlights for you there is a spiny leaf insect in the bottom left. That's on my hand, and that's one of our beautiful stick insects in this region. A little tiny kingfisher that was found after it had fallen. In the top middle there is an average-sized amethystine python. Wonder who that could be in the image. That's totally legal. And on the top middle right is a cassowary, which you may know as one of the most dangerous birds in the world. Why I've included that is that's a picture of it outside one of my best mates' back door. It was following the grocery delivery man. So they are not just out in the remote jungle. We are in the remote jungle. We intruded on their habitat, and cassowaries are all about. So we can and we do encounter them with some frequency and regularity in our fieldwork. It's just another hazard to be aware of. However, while they're dangerous, cassowaries do not attack unless provoked. I personally think they're very gentle animals, don't deserve their bad reputation, and don't deserve our fear. What does, though, is that little scorpion over there on the top right. So that is a bark scorpion hormurus, and you can see by its tiny sting and big claws, this one doesn't have very strong venom. It relies on its claws to crush prey. But if you were to flip that around with thin little claws and a big sting, and there's plenty of those too, that's a dangerous animal. Bottom right is that beautiful stick insect we spoke about earlier, and then the center lowest image is a brush tarantula. While we may not be well known for our tarantulas as well as other invertebrates, we still have some pretty spectacular specimens. They're nothing like the South American spiders, but they're amazing, and we even have one of the rare social spiders in the world, the social pygmy tarantula, which lives in family groups in little burrows. So, but Tropics is full of surprises. And that's just a picture of something that can happen during field work. As much as you prepare for everything, you can't be prepared for every unexpected element. So while we were working in the bush one day, we came across a wallaby mother that had been killed by wild dogs. That's an invasive species, feral animals. And we were able to take the joey out and rescue it. It wasn't dead yet. Take it to a wallaby carer. You can see that joey in there is so young it hasn't even got hair yet. It's surprising how common this happens. So a lot of our staff are trained in wildlife rescue in addition to entomology. You'd be surprised how often those skills come in handy. Now, That was a whirlwind tour of all the things that are part of my job and part of living and working as an entomologist in far north Queensland. So I want to move along to reviewing what my experience in Science Olympiad was like and offering tips to Science Olympiad students. Dr. John mentioned earlier, I don't have a huge amount of experience with the event descriptions for entomology this time around. So the tips I can offer you are more general, and they're based in my experience doing mostly study events back more than a decade ago, 2009, 2010, but a lot of the principles are going to hold true. The events that I did were mainly things like I did do sort of earth science type events, ecology focused events, and all the ologies. Entomology wasn't around when I was in there, or I would have been straight into it. Herpetology, ornithology, birds was probably my main event. Fossils, all those kinds of natural history events. And study events, trying to understand what a test is going to require of you or anticipate it is very difficult. You can look into past tests done by that particular administrator if you have the ability to do that research. You can look at archive tests if they're available. You can train, I would say, get a great diversity of people to write you tests with diverse levels of experiences, because it'll be surprising what people come up with as questions, especially if they have less experience in a field. I found that some of the trickiest questions I've gotten were from, in ornithology, for example, were from people that didn't have a huge amount of experience there. They found these questions, but they weren't the questions I would have thought of as someone that had more of a core understanding of the discipline, if that makes sense. They were more peripheral questions. And when we talk about study resources, skills from Science Olympiad are something I have gone on to use throughout undergrad and in my master's degree and on in life. And chief among those is creating resources, collating your research, doing your own learning, and knowing what those resources look like. When you're creating a resource material, whether it's a little notebook, a full binder, or just a resource sheet, and I use them all nowadays as well, it's critical to do it yourself, even if you end up learning most of the content that is in that resource and you don't end up needing it. Knowing where it all is and going through the process of looking these things up, critically evaluating your sources, collecting what you find to be most reliable or most coherent, putting it in an order that works for you. All of that is incredibly important because it doesn't just develop a physical resource for you to look at. It develops the filing system in your mind into which further information and also questions during a test can be slotted in. And it makes it possible to use that resource super fast. Conversely, one shouldn't just go through Wikipedia articles, print them out, and chuck them all in a binder together, as beautifully tabbed as that resource may be. You don't know it. You need to really know your research. Which brings me to a question that many people have had about developing further knowledge in entomology. Water break. Mainly that the identification is one thing, but learning the so-called trivia is very different. Sure, identification by a key is one thing, and one should generally be able to fall back on a dichotomous key. But when you're looking at something like entomology for Science Olympiad, which I believe goes down to fairly superficial taxonomic levels in terms of identification, general recognition principles are also going to be important for you in terms of being able to do it quickly. So snap recognition, not necessarily keying out every specimen. And that was something I had to do during my master's degree in, in my exams, snap recognition of specimens and very rapid ID. And it's something that we do as well in my job identifying ants to morphospecies and species. Yes, we have to key them out for definitive purposes, but it's amazing how many of them, now that we're experienced, my team and I can use snap recognition to sort, and we turn out to be right. In addition to that, learning the natural history is, in my opinion, even more important. This is where you go from being not just a scientist, but also a naturalist. What I mean by the term naturalist is someone that appreciates connection across the whole ecological sphere, not just what each species is, not just its base functions, its functional traits and how they help it fulfill its niche, its role, but how that interacts with all other elements of the ecosystem. So one example of that, in terms of invasive species, I'll give you one of invasive species. Those beautiful big green ants I showed you that are so annoying and bitey are critically important because while they don't feed on plant nectar directly, they patrol plants. They have an instinct to protect plants from herbivores, predators, leaf predators, caterpillars and grasshoppers and things. So those green ants, by their presence, protect these plants and allow not only crops to flourish, that's why people like them in citrus and cacao plantations, but also our native plants to fruit and flower effectively, which supports the rest of the ecosystem. When yellow crazy ants come along, they eliminate those green ants. They either kill them or extirpate them, even though the yellow crazy ants are smaller. That's another fun fact about ants. Usually smaller ants will win because there's more of them. So yellow crazy ants cause an interruption to that whole ecosystem. And you can notice this in the different behavior of other animals. You'll find other ants are patrolling on leaves where once green ants would have kept them off. You'll find increased defoliation of plants. And you'll find scale insects in increasing profusion because yellow crazy ants farm those insects and they're destructive to plants. So all these different elements of the ecosystem. In terms of other groups of insects and learning the natural history of them, I believe the best way to do that is experientially. You have to get out there and get involved with entomologist types. Now, I know you're probably ringing in from all around the country, so I can't offer you anything specific. But contacting your local uni, your local community college, or local natural history museum or science museum, asking if they have entomology staff that you could talk to, or maybe assist, whether that's looking through collections, picking up and gleaning tidbits from them, or going out in the field and just taking a hike looking for insects. That's the best way to experience them and gain insight into where they're found, what they do, what they look like, what they act like. And of course, reading widely. You can't go past it. So I think from a very young age, I've been fascinated by entomology, medical entomology, natural history, and reading books along those lines, even if they're just kind of infotainment books, not necessarily nonfiction and science information books, has gone a long way to helping me gain interesting little tidbits that ended up being really useful down the line. So I would say to nourish that curiosity. Don't go into it with the expectation that you can learn everything about every insect. There's always going to be questions that you don't know. But developing a genuine interest will help that knowledge stick a lot better in your mind. And consider putting out a light sheet. That's what's going on in this picture here. When the weather warms up, I think for you it's still cold that time of year. Insects will come to it and it will give you a lot of interesting samples to identify. Just hang out a white sheet at night and shine a bright light on it and they'll come. Or go look under a street lamp. So I know we're running low on time, 8:44. Okay. And I wanted to bring it on to some closing remarks before questions here. That's just a picture of me in my beloved rainforest that I currently am so fortunate to call home. That's our botanical gardens. And bring it forward to remind you that Science Olympiad is for now, but it's also for life. That's what I've found it to be. It wasn't just something to help me gain experience, extracurricular credit in high school to get into a better university. It's come along with me, and I've continued to be involved in various ways, sometimes more, sometimes less, through the years. And I really treasure the knowledge, the team skills, the study skills, and other skills that I've gained from my experience with the program, as well as treasuring the memories of going to competitions, learning different things, meeting interesting people. So I would say that it's been 15 years, 16 years, 15 years from now and further, you won't remember a lot of the specifics, but you will remember learning something new and amazing, sharing it with other people, the process of learning, the joy of learning, and a love for nature that this fosters. And for me, in terms of entomology, that last point, if they learn to love bugs because of you, through releasing my book and through my job, working with my team and working with the public, I've interacted with thousands of people across the community and been fortunate enough to help bring a love for nature and insects and ants to them, foster an appreciation for this amazing part of the world. So in doing that, I'm unintentionally going back to the wish that I made in that poem all those many decades ago. I hope that there will be bugs forever. And I think this is something you have the power to take action on too. So join me in studying entomology and spreading the good world to the rest of the world. And together we can make sure that there are bugs forever. Now I would like to move on to question time.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Jules. Yeah, so if you guys have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. Um, and while we're waiting for the our audience to throw some questions out, Jules, can I toss you a question real quick?
Please.
And I apologize, but so if the yellow crazy ants, they're an invasive species to Australia, correct?
Hmm.
Where
Yes,
where'd they come from? Are they
this is an interesting
native?
question. So when we look at the genetic evidence for yellow crazy ants are in the genus Anapolepus, which is an African genus at the moment. But that species is found mostly in Southeast Asia. And the genetic evidence, as well as the behavioral evidence, which I'll explain shortly, points to that region of the world. When I say behavioral evidence, ants are highly plastic, and yellow crazy ants, as an invasive species, have some very plastic behavioral traits. So in this invasive region of the world, they behave invasively. Their colonies all get along. When they want to found a new colony, they just kind of gather up some queens and workers and they walk off together, remaining connected to the main nest by a supply line. But in their native part of the world, they still do that old-fashioned ant thing of a new queen flying off on her lonesome to start a new nest. That's a very sort of more primitive, conserved, traditional ant behavior. That's something that a non-invasive species would do in many cases. So evidence like that also helps us determine, as well as evidence of the surrounding ant community. There's balance in a lot of those parts of the world, like Fiji, Bali. You can go and see yellow crazy ants acting not crazy there. But in this part of the world, they rapidly build up to huge numbers. There's very little other diversity of animals and invertebrates present, and the evidence of their invasive character is very, very clear, particularly given some of the emerging research we have coming out. Hopefully, in a couple of months, maybe this year, we've got the output from one of our recent terrestrial invertebrate surveys maybe getting published. So that's really exciting. And it demonstrates absolutely conclusively the negative impact of the ants on biodiversity.
Okay.
I should add that's the first time that's ever been shown in a scientific study in mainland Australia. Most of the work has been done on islands because working on the mainland is really hard. Islands are easy.
All right. So while we're you answer that one, and thank you so much. John threw in the chat or the
Oh,
Q&A and has a question about really like studying terminology. And he refers to it as a worth learning, and kind of knowing archaic or obsolete terminology when it comes to groups and anatomy. And his context is he's been using a textbook from 1957 to study from a lot. And there's some definitely older terms. Like how, I mean, I guess how important do you think some of the old stuff is compared to like more of the new kind of cutting edge stuff you were talking about, even just with even your own study with the yellow crazy ants?
pathmetometabolous. What a word. I do not know that word. I think it depends upon who's writing your test, but I would skew towards modern usage. That's going to be the easiest information for people to find if they're writing and they don't know the field. It's going to be more reliable, and also it's going to serve you best in your future studies and future career. So some examples of strange terminology that showed up on past tests I've taken at nationals a few years, 15, 10 years ago. Things like life list, which is not a technical term in ornithology, or chalasium, which is a technical term, but the modern term is chalaza. I think in terms of entomology, we should be very aware that, particularly in taxonomy, the field is evolving pretty quickly. At least among the ants, stuff is getting shaken up all the time. And where species exactly belong, or whether they're a species at all, really depends upon whose PhD is going well at the time, which is why we don't worry as much about that. We worry about morphospecies. You'll find, at least for ants, that a lot of the anatomy and physiology terms have been conserved. They're the same as they always were. So we at work use the same Shattuck and Co. 1990s ant key, and it serves perfectly well for anatomical terms. But in terms of where the species are, everything has changed. So I would say find some things that are more modern, ask your natural history museum. If their response is that such and such genus was resolved in 1957 and that's the last word, that's fine. But you can often find hobbyists out there who have been doing a lot of the recent work. There are people with a niche interest in all these different insect groups. I would connect with them if you're curious about a particular group.
Okay. And it seems like that's like a lot of the times, especially in the more classic classification events like entomology, um, trying to strike that balance between sort of accepted science or generally accepted science and where the cutting edge and the hobbyists and some of the
Yeah,
current researchers are pushing the envelope. Um, any tips on like how to recognize valid sources or appropriate, you know what I mean, appropriate people versus, someone that may be way like cutting edge or it's John in his backyard who, my love of ants.
that's an interesting question. To take a couple steps back, there have definitely been instances during tests in Science Olympiad. I think most notably for me was at a state or a regional where there were errors in the questions, and I had to bring them up to the proctor after and ask, like, your multiple choice here, none of them are right, and actually it's supposed to be this, or such and such, you said this was the same species, but really it's the same family, things like that. And things do get lost in technical terms, so it's really good to be across that stuff. In terms of judging your sources, we're very lucky up here in the far north. It is insect heaven, super biodiverse. What that means is we have a good, strong, diverse, and reliable community of insect enthusiasts. I'm really, really lucky in that way. Now, there are weird bug people everywhere. I would know because I'm one of them. And you can find them. But up here in the far north, it's so much easier to do that. So there are regular events. For me, I'm very lucky that I can meet those people personally, speak with them, get a feel for their methods, and understand whether the information they provide is reliable. And you make an interesting example about such and such in his backyard with ants, but actually, we have a man up here who's from America and now lives in North Queensland, David Rents, who puts a light sheet up in his backyard every night. He's not really active in academia, but he's discovered so many species and named so many species that he is an absolute local legend. His specialty is cockroaches and katydids, but he can identify just about anything that comes by you. Then we have other people who are just beginners, kids, who have an incredible level of knowledge that probably I could never hope to achieve. The world of insects is very diverse. So I think in interrogating sources, if you can meet them, that's great. Talk with them and get a feel for their methods. The more different people you meet, the better you're going to be able to judge. So find that community. They may not even know about Science Olympiad. You might find that they're thrilled to come in and speak with you.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always found that when you find you can connect your interests with somebody else's interests and passions, they're
Mhm.
always willing to share about it, and
Yeah,
help you out and help you learn.
especially when it's bugs, they're going to be like, yeah, man, you want to hear about my life's passion? No one's ever asked me. And it's so good. This is like when people get me started on ants. It's so good.
Well, it just amazes me listening to you talk about and that I think in my head, you take certain things for granted, right? Like we've identified, you mean that like all this stuff has been identified, right? Or there's very
Oh no.
definitive classifications. And then you're sharing these stories about, a guy in his backyard's finding stuff or that great picture you had of, oh yeah, when I saw this, I thought it was just like, your typical walking stick kind of insect and turned out
Mm.
it's a totally different insect.
And not only that, Acrophila alta is the heaviest stick insect in the world, so she's a champion too.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I'll give you another example about undescribed species or unknown species. Up here in the wet tropics, we have a little genus of extremely smelly tree ants. They call them the cocktail ants, Anonychomerma. And we thought we had, 12 species in the wet tropics. It's a big, big region along the east, up northeast coast. Once upon a time, a couple years ago, one of the ant nerds at JCU or at Wet Tropics decided we're just going to do a quick survey. They only checked 8 mountain peaks and they found 15 more. Just all those. And you know how many mountains there are in this mountain range.
Yeah.
Estimates support that we have discovered and described less than half of the ants in Australia. And we're already #1 in the world for number of species. So if we had the bandwidth to really look at and describe all those species, do the investigations, Australia would be an undisputed champion. I'm absolutely certain. In addition to the ants also being the coolest looking. It just goes to show you that there is a lot to discover out there. Will I be identifying and describing those species? I don't know. I don't know if my studies and work are leading me in that direction. I'm really enjoying the more interacting with the community, connecting, helping people come into a love of nature. As someone very famous, I can't remember, once said, people can't protect what they don't know. They can't love what they don't know, which is why I put out things like the ant book to help people understand that even in those tiny animals that are pests, there is a great deal to love. I've just dropped the link to the ant book in the chat there. So you can click through if you want to read
Yep. And we will
and
make sure
download it.
and we'll make sure when it goes up on YouTube, we'll include the link in the description so people can have access to it as well.
Oh,
In
we
your
got a question.
Yep, and John tossed in this question, but he's wants to know, do you have any advice on how, I love how he phrased it. How do you square being fascinated by insects, but also scared of them? He finds cave crickets and bladodines especially unnerving, and wonder if you ever worked with any people who've had that kind of apprehension, right? That you're totally fascinated by it, but you're somewhat leery or, you know, you know, afraid of the what they
Hmm.
want to study.
That's an interesting question. So if you've ever been to the doctor and had your reflexes tested, they whack you on the knee with a little hammer and you kick. Well, our brain has circuits like that too, and those circuits activate for roaches. So you are not alone. There's something about the speed, the scuttling, the way the legs are sprayed out. It circumvents the conscious thought and goes straight to a little jump of fear. And that's tough up here in the tropics because literally everything is roach infested. I know some people probably don't want to think about that, but they're everywhere, just like every other insect. And things like cave crickets that are all kind of long with the wavy antennae, pretty spider-like. I think for me, the key is exposure. I was very fortunate. I had a lot of insect exposure from a young age and intentional practice. I'm not saying like exposure therapy, thinking, oh, this is really scary and I'm going to hold it, but taking yourself closer to it step by step without getting into that heightened state, taking the time to appreciate these amazing animals. If you can get in touch with and work with someone who's very confident with them, like I have a good mate who's only 16, by the way, very into Myrmecia, those big, venomous bull ants, super scary ants, and he free handles them. I've got another mate that happily free handles venomous centipedes, giant venomous centipedes, because they have that experience to work with those animals. Would I do those things? No, because I can conduct a risk assessment and I don't want to be stung. But I don't have the instinctive fear because I've been close and worked with them doing this outreach. And also handling a lot of things that look similar but aren't that bad, like handling harmless ants. I love it. And I love showing kids that there's nothing to be afraid of inherently about ants. You'd be surprised how many kids at outreach events don't have that inherent fear of insects. It's something they learn from media and culturally. But if you get to them young, scoop up some spider ants and hand them off to the kid, and they'll hold it. They'll look at it and wonder. That's something we all have.
Oh, that's great advice. Though I will tell you, you're confirming a theory I hold, and that is that the entire continent of Australia just wants to kill us. Um,
Everybody says that. That's not true. We don't even
it,
have any large predators.
I,
You
it's
have
not the large.
bears. Get
I'd
over
settle,
it.
Jules. I'd settle for large predators. Like what's terrifying is like, oh yeah, this is venomous. That's venomous. It's pretty much like it sounds like it's an assumption there. If you find something, it's probably venomous.
That's why you want to go with someone who knows their insects.
Yeah.
Yeah, we even have dangerous and venomous and deadly plants. It's all working in the rainforest here is such a trip.
I can only imagine. There was a I I saw a great video not that long ago of there was a golf tournament in Australia, and
Uh-oh.
just one of these giant, is it a brown snake, like some super
Hmm.
poisonous long snake, just decides as everyone's walking around the course and following the golfers around, it just decides I'm going right through it, and there's a couple policemen just kind of walking with the like walking the snake across the golf course and kind of keeping people away from it. But it was absolutely just a ridiculous kind of scene, it seemed.
I can explain to you why that happened.
Yeah,
So
I'd
the
love
golf
to hear it.
tournament, the golf course is not in use every day, but you know who is there every day? Brown snakes. Those big elapids. Now I know this because I'm also trained in venomous snake handling and I work in snake removals sometimes, which I'm going to grab you an amazing picture of that. Um, Brown snakes, like other large elapids, especially in those arid zones, they need to hunt daily and they have a defined territory and a defined path that they will go around once per day. And if you know your snake and it comes through your yard at 12:30 afternoon tea time every day, you know where it's going to be and you can stay out of its way. So that snake lives on that golf course. And it's not his fault that there happened to be a golf tournament happening when it was his time to go through and look for rats. I mean, most of the area was probably really arid. Humans went ahead and made this beautiful, lush golf course, probably full of delicious mice and rats. You can't blame a brown snake.
no,
That's just my opinion.
no,
I'm
you're
trying to
right.
find a picture here from my snake handling course because it's wild. But yes, we get a bad rap for a lot of venomous animals, but I think part of that is reputational. People love the drama of, oh, Australia, crazy wild. But really, the tarantulas are not that bad. The spiders are not that bad. The snakes, okay, sometimes, but they usually don't want to be anywhere near you. And I take my chances over those little things because I know how to deal with them and over really large, unpredictable animals, including the cassowary, which I've had many encounters with them over the years, and it's never been an issue. There we go. Let me just bring this up and then I can screen share for you. I had to scroll through all my cuddling wallaby images. I've got a good mate that does wildlife caring, so we see a fair bit of that as well. Probably the only thing you should really be worried about is the crocodiles in the waterways. They do not mess around. And a little bit more, just so you know, we've only ever had like 2 snake incidents in my job. They're very rare. Generally, the snakes can hear you coming. Yes, they don't have ears, but they can hear the vibrations in the ground and they don't want anything to do with it. Remember, there's no really large predators, so if something huge comes glumping through, they know it's time to get out. Yep, so that's a king brown there, mulga snake. That's our largest brown snake. What a cutie, huh?
Yeah. All right. Well, Jules, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Loved learning more about the work you're doing and the efforts you guys are making to study ants and understand the biosecurity. And thank you for the tips and the conversation for everybody. Like I said, if everyone, thank you guys for attending. We got a couple more webinars coming up. We're doing another one later this month on, believe it's the 25th. We're going to be talking about summer programming for both students and coaches. So if you're interested, please pass the word to either yourself, your teammates, your coach. It'd be greatly appreciated. But otherwise, please thank Jules for me and thank you so much. And you have a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me.